Okay, most welcome to this IMS webinar, and welcome to you, Uzma. I will introduce you in a minute. So, IMS is the Institute for Research on Multi-Religious and Secular Swedish Society, basically. And one of our purposes is to make accessible research that is happening on the multi-religious Swedish society. And this is starting from this insight that Sweden today is Europe's most multi-religious country, and it's also at the same time one of the most secular countries in the world. So we have this sort of double situation when it comes to religion in this country, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you, Dr. Uzma Kazi. You are a sociologist from Lund University. And today you will speak about your research, and which was defended in your PhD dissertation on the belonging narratives of second-generation Pakistani Muslims in Sweden. So we will do like this. You will give a talk presenting your research. Then we will have a brief discussion, and then there will be the opportunity for people listening in to ask their questions. And if you are listening to this and you want to ask a question, you can do so while Uzma is presenting. And then you do this through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom line of your Zoom window. So there you can write your questions, and I will then moderate and take these questions and ask them to Uzma at the end of our session. And we have 1 hour exactly to do this. So with no further ado, please, Dr. Kazi, if you would give us your presentation.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. Just before I share my screen for my presentation, I just wanted to say that what I'm presenting today is a chapter in my thesis, and the chapter focuses on religion. So while my work is in sort of interdisciplinary study with cultural studies, anthropology, and sociology, particularly for this talk, I decided to focus on the chapter that was talking about sort of negotiations around religion, right? So basically, I'm just going to share the screen now. Just a second. Yeah, can we all see the screen? Yeah. Okay, so basically, this presentation is titled Negotiating Being Muslim in Sweden. I just wanted to sort of place this presentation within the larger context of the project, which is called Swedish Desi, Belonging Narratives of second-generation Pakistani Muslims in Sweden. Now, Swedish Desi means sort of this, it kind of signposts a hybrid identity. And I wanted to use Desi because Pakistanis are South Asians and they're part of this region, mostly with Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. And Desi is also a colloquial term that has been used by writers, particularly brown writers in the UK and also in the United States, where they talk about Desiness, which is referring to the South Asian heritage of second generation. It's also something that was used by my participants when I was interviewing them. So I thought that was interesting to sort of forefront that they are Swedish, but they're also Desi. Now, Pardesi is a word in Urdu which refers to Pardes, which is abroad. And it also means signals sort of someone that is a traveler, a vagabond, someone that's a globe-trotter. So in that way, and par as a word, also like a side word in Urdu, means however, or but, or something else. So in that way, there's a lot of like play on words with this title, and I thought it was very interesting also because I'm very interested in post-colonial and decolonial sort of theories, and I think it's very, very important to sort of put these kind of words front and center, particularly as they're linguistically important for the participants who I was researching. Now, the main questions, basically, I was interested in studying the lived experience of Muslims in Sweden. There's a lot of research that does come out of sociology of religion, particularly in Sweden, because of Sweden's multi-religious nature. That said, there's not a lot of work that is done, particularly on South Asians and particularly on Pakistanis in Sweden. So that was sort of like there was a paucity in literature around Pakistanis, and I was a Pakistani. And my own background has been such that, my father was a banker and a diplomat. So I've lived in China, I've lived in the United States, in New York. I went to study in the States, then I lived in Sweden, went back to Pakistan, came back here. So I've lived as a Pakistani, as an expat in a transnational community, traveling back and forth, and also meeting with other Pakistanis and other immigrant groups. And that kind of exposure and experience sparked my curiosity, particularly when I came to Sweden. And I'll refer to what David just said, like the extremely secular nature of Sweden, yet the mix with religious freedom and having a multi-religious society. It was very interesting for me. How do sort of these interactions look like on a micro level basis? So we have a lot of, and I wanted to sort of have this multi-layered study, which led me to asking these questions. How do second generation Pakistanis experience their Pakistani, Muslim, and Swedish identities? What do these experiences and negotiations look like? And how do these negotiations sort of inform belongingness of these participants? So that's the larger context of the project. And then, like I already spoke that there were many things about Sweden that impressed upon me and made this more exciting as a study because of its progressive sort of policy landscape. It's known for human rights. It's known to be gender equal. It's branded and as sort of a welfare state, known within the Scandinavian region for this kind of a very progressive policy landscape. It's got a diverse Muslim population, and it's been known for its very welcoming nature towards immigrants. That said, post 9/11, I do think, the entire world shifted, and also several crises, like whether it was the financial crisis or the oil crisis, it impacted the entire world. And these were contemporary social tensions that then, we create scapegoats when there's a problem, and sometimes policies shift, and these kind of tensions become highlighted in everyday landscape of lived experiences. And so with rising Islamophobia and this kind of polarization, debates, particularly highlighting Muslims as the problematic community all across the world, really, Muslims suddenly became suspect, and they were suspicious within, like while they were citizens, they were not quite, 100%, like it felt like their allegiances belonged elsewhere. So it was this tension. I do think Sweden, because of its, generous sort of migration policies, but also welfare policies, becomes a very interesting institutional arena to sort of gain insights from when it comes to the experiences from the participants. And I do think within sort of like a global sense, Sweden is a part of Europe, it's a part of Scandinavia, so it kind of reflects broadly on Europe's sort of Christian background, and it's sort of, Europe has always seen itself as sort of opposite to Islam. Like Islam and Christianity have always seen each other as like these two powerhouses sort of, engaged in some kind of a struggle. And Sweden is a part of that as well. And it was interesting to see how migration, identity, and these power struggles within everyday life become a microcosm for understanding Muslim experiences in liberal democracies. So that was one of the reasons why I found Sweden to be a very interesting landscape. Like the context became very, very interesting. So very quickly about the research population and the methods that I used to gain access. Of course, being Pakistani did help. There was also something that I set out to do very early on. I did not wish to start while I know that there's registered congregants and a lot of times researchers use mosques and Islamic organizations as the place from where they start their sampling, I actually wanted to stay away from that because I wanted to have a broader sample in terms of people who were, most of the time when you're a part of these organizations, I would assume that you have a very strong sense of what your identity is. And I wanted to sort of bring in all kinds of people and different sort of, registers of Muslimness, so I wanted to stay away. While of course I did recruit from mosques, I did approach Islamic organizations, but I used predominantly a snowball sample. So I had different sample seeds, and from there, friends and friends of friends. And I just wanted to highlight that I'm a first generation Pakistani Muslim, so I'm not a part of the diaspora in the sense of the people who are second generation. They've been, or third generation, that I was able to access. I am considered like a newcomer. I wasn't really a part of the diaspora because my parents were not living here, and I had not come during the 60s and 70s. I had not grown up here. I was not a part of the education system here, except, I was a PhD student at Lund University, but not in the same way. Like, I did not study Swedish. So there was that difference between the first and the second generation. And I chose the second generation for that reason. I wanted to understand, when you're born and raised as Swedish citizens in Sweden, how does religiosity and, ethnicity and citizenship sort of come together. So I interviewed 42 participants that self-identified as Muslims, all of them from a Pakistani background, most of them born and raised in Sweden, because I also interviewed some parents. So that's why I say most of them born and raised in Sweden. The parents are mostly working class, but I do want to make a little bit of a note here that a lot of parents, for example, that were journalists or doctors in Pakistan, when they came into the Swedish labor market, they became working class. So that's not to say that the educational background of all these parents was the same, but when they embedded themselves in the labor market in Sweden at that time, without language skills and without sort of translatable educational skills, they were mostly, when the second generation described their parents, they described them as having working class jobs. The cities mostly were the three major cities in Sweden: Stockholm, Malmö, Göteborg, but also some people from Lund who were living in Stockholm moved to Lund. So I sort of, did those interviews in Lund. The age group was 18 to 49, and the 49-year-old, and there was another 45-year-old, they were actually second generation and had third generation children. So I kind of like the idea of having a broader sample, sort of trying to understand intergenerational dynamics as well. So I kept that sampling, of course, 18 when you can give consent for interviews, but also I didn't keep the gap smaller. It's pretty equal between men and women, and there were 10 sibling pairs and 2 parent-child sibling pairs. So that means that I interviewed 1 parent and 2 siblings, so that's like a triad. And then I also interviewed sort of parent and child, which was like dyads. And that was something that just came about during the process of sort of interviewing. So I did a snowball sample. These were life story interviews with an autobiographical sort of perspective, starting from their parents' journey to Sweden, and then, where they were at in their lives at that moment, and then like their vision for the future. I also attended some congregations in the mosque. I attended a poetry recitation. I attended a New Year's Eve dinner. So a lot of these findings are sort of, they connect to the participant observation that I did. And the writing it also reflects in the writing. I did a thematic narrative analysis based on all the themes that emerged, keeping, of course, the ethnic, religious, and national perspectives, like what are these cultural repertoires, what are these scripts, and how do they interact with each other. The communication was mostly in Urdu and English because I don't speak Swedish. And I do think that that was a setback sometimes, even in my snowball. Like if someone could not speak Urdu or English because they maybe did not complete high school, it did mean that one of the limitations of my sample was that all of these people could speak good English and could converse well in Urdu as well. So that part of the sample I could not access, unfortunately. So moving on, I do want to say that when I started my research, I wanted to understand these identity clashes, or maybe how these identity scripts are sort of, converging, in how they entangled. Eventually, like once I sat with all my material and I went through all the interviews, I actually realized that it was better understood. These identity negotiations were better understood when I use the concept of belonging, because a lot of times what identity became a tool to understand the kind of connections and social bonds one could create. And that meant there was a lot of like sense of home and feeling of home and familiarity and bonds and connections. And so when these words started to come, like safety, security, it said much more than just identity. Identity was a tool that was being used for belonging. And therefore, I sort of changed. And in my thesis, I sort of theorized belonging in three ways. One is like the resources for belonging, where I look at sort of the social location, which is the diaspora. This second generation is growing up in a diaspora where their parents have come from another place, they're born here, and they have this kind of future orientation towards sort of transnational connections, but also to the place of their birth. And that's a very specific social location in the diaspora. And then you look at how do you experience sort of identification, embeddedness, connectedness, and attachments. So I use the idea of sort of both being born in the diaspora as a resource for for belonging, the national Swedish national identity as a resource for belonging, and also being a Muslim, like that idea of religion being in their repertoire also as a resource for belonging. So it's a culmination of all these resources that they sort of use in order to understand where they belong. Now, once you have these repertoires, it's also a meaning-making endeavor. So for me, I was struggling with the word boundary, because for me, boundary was like a boundary wall, and I saw brick and mortar, and then I realized that meaning-making is actually sort of boundary work. You create meaning, and boundary, as I understand it in this thesis, is protecting what you value. So when I sort of thought, going through all the interviews, what is boundary representing? It was actually representing protecting what individuals valued, and that created meaning for upholding something for them. So that's how I understood. So belonging as meaning making. So the first aspect of belonging in my thesis I used as resources, and all these three identities as resources, meaning making as boundary work, and boundary understood as protecting what you value. And then negotiations that entail sort of for inclusion and against inclusion, because a lot of times that was what was at stake. So when you're protecting what you value, you also understand how to value it. And that's what motivates action. So that was the last part of that negotiation, that you negotiate between different things, the kind of values that they create, but how can you in turn create that value for yourself where you're living at, in order to include yourself and protect yourself against exclusion. So it's a combined result of sort of feeling trust and feeling safety, and feeling protected. So that's how I understood belonging, but also particularly for this research, and also for each of my chapter, I was thinking with one concept that could explain it. And because intersectionality is something, again, that I feel like in the literature in Sweden particularly, we don't really use it as such to understand religion. So I like this quote by, just a second, by Ellis, who says, the environment in which adherents do religion exists within a broader landscape of stratification. So because I am coming from, mainstream sociology at Lund University, and this was a topic within, I kind of not only wanted to understand articulations of religiosity, but I also wanted to understand what impacts that religiosity and how it impacts when you're doing religion, what kind of things impact your ability to do it, given that, we have freedom of religion. So I like this concept of complex religion, which is an intersectional. So it's basically intersectionality, but it's centering on the experience of religion, because intersectionality altogether means, it can be social class, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, etc. But when you center it around the experience of religion, then that intersectionality says something different about each experience. So with complex religion, it's a framework that goes beyond understanding religion as merely personal or ritual. And it is a layered and dynamic system of meaning making, and it interacts with identities and structural inequalities. And it challenges the idea that religion is private and static or separable from other axes of identity, which kind of is, the idea of Sweden being extremely secular. I think complex religion explains the religiosity of my participants. So it's intersectional. It recognizes that religion intersects with race, class, gender, and national belonging. It's also contextual. It's aware of power relations, how religion interacts with other stratification structures in society, and it is not reducible, that it's not just identity alone, but it's an evolving experience. So I think keeping these two frames, theoretical frames in mind as we go forward, we might have like a good understanding of where I'm leading with this chapter. So the three questions that are guiding this presentation are: one, how can we understand religious identity as a process rather than a fixed label? How can this framework of boundary crossing, shifting, and maintaining help us reimagine identity beyond binaries? And what do these narratives teach us about the complexity of negotiating belonging in a secular and multicultural society? So I've actually chosen to do, it was very difficult to bring everything and have like one chunk of sort of like a quote where I could explain. But I think what I'm going to do with this presentation particularly is, from here on, there are three things that I observed that was happening when I talked about sort of religious negotiations with my participants. So the three things were that, one, there was a very few, but there were few who said that they were not Muslim anymore. So that for me, I started that conceptualizing as crossing boundaries. So let's say crossing the boundary of Muslimness to not being Muslim. Then the second one was shifting boundaries, where certain participants said that, our religiosity was very private, but then suddenly it actually became very salient. So it became dominant and we started to show it much more. It became more conspicuous. So in that way, it was an identity that was always there. It was a script that was existing, but it was like, deeply embedded. But then something activated it for it to become more conspicuous. So that's the second half of shifting boundaries. And the third one is maintaining, which means that while there was no shift or activation, people were practicing, but the way that the practices were evolving and their meaning was evolving for them. So in this first case, crossing boundaries, because there were only 3 participants that said that they were not Muslim anymore, I'm using the first one as a detailed case. So I will go through. So this is kind of like a life trajectory, and there were 3 phases of this participant, who's a 34-year-old Pakistani, grew up in Stockholm, was living in Skåne at the time when I interviewed him. So when I actually asked to interview him, he said, but I don't consider myself Muslim, so why would I give this interview? But then I convinced his sibling, who I'd already interviewed, that please just ask him for me. It's equally important to understand Muslimness through people who are not Muslim anymore, because sometimes to understand why someone is not explains why someone is, or vice versa. So then he agreed when she spoke to him, and he said, okay, let's do this. And I asked him about that. So he started his interview by telling me that, well, I'm not Muslim. And then I'm like, so like, what happened? And then he's like, well, by the time he said by till he was 19, he was a Muslim. And he says, I remember trying to pray 5 times a day. I took fasting very seriously. And he's like, I wasn't really doing it because I wanted to please my parents, or I wasn't really doing it because, my friends were particularly Muslim in that way. Neither were my siblings. He said he was like the second oldest. But he said that I wanted to be a good Muslim. It was something that came from inside me. And then he said something started to change when I became 19. And then and I asked him, so what was it? He's like, well, there was this idea of like, he's like, when I had questions and I would go to my parents, they were being very Desi. They said, no, we're not going to discuss this. This is just how it is. They were firm and they were strict. And he says most of the time, if I ask them, why can't we date, or why can't we go out? Why can't I go to the club? They would just say, well, we're Pakistanis and we're Muslims and this is how we do it. And then he said things started to shift. He's like, first it started out with my girlfriend. He's like, I had one and I was hiding from my parents. And then I felt really irritated that I had to do that just because they were firm and strict and they did not understand. And he's like, then there's this whole idea of arranged marriages within the family that I was opposed to. He's like, then a friend gave me this book called God Delusion. I read that. And he says, things began to shift and I started to become a far more rational human being. And he says that I needed to understand things, but I was not getting that understanding at home. And then he said there was another friend of his, when his mom passed away, he got double inheritance than his sisters, according to what he thought is like, it is Islamic law. And he said that really irritated me. And then he's like, well, in the end, it was like being Muslim also meant being Pakistani. And because of all these things that one, my parents could not explain to me, and two, I did not have the energy or the time to find out on my own. It just felt that it was to leave one was to leave the other. So he's like, I kind of, in order for me to stop being Muslim was also to stop being Pakistani, and to stop being Pakistani meant also stop being Muslim. So he's like, I had to leave this culture because for him, this idea of Muslimness came from the culture. So this was the first phase of the turning points that he described about not being Muslim that had to do with family dynamics and inability of parents, particularly coming from, and this person, and particularly his parents came from a small town. They came here during the 1960s, and the father was doing working class jobs, working most nights. Mother was the only person that was home, and she also started working. So he remembers his home as one where people, like both the parents, worked really hard. And while they were available, sometimes they were not available for these deeper conversations. The second part has to do with sort of the general Islamophobia and racism in Sweden, where he then sort of moves on in his story to also talk. And again, when you talk to participants when you ask them the same question several times, and this was like a 3-4 hour interview, they give you different reasons for the same thing. So when he started with this idea. He's like, it was because of my girlfriend and it was because of my parents. And then he's like, also then, when I went to school and I was standing with a bunch of my like Swedish friends, like colleagues from school. And he's like, these Somali women passed and they were wearing their, the hijabs and the sort of the coats, the abayas. And he's like, this friend of mine, he just looked at them and had a disgusted look on his face. And he's like, what is this? Are we like in a Star Wars movie? And he's like, I really hate religion. So for him, now this is a stage where he's like between the ages of 15 and 19. And a lot of this has to do with sort of impression management. And he says that, and we also, when we look at ourselves through the eyes of the other. So when people are looking at other people who also sort of have this expression of Muslimness, which is different from ours, but it's still there, and you have colleagues and friends and classmates who are saying, oh, I really hate religion, you kind of think about, what do they think of me? And then he says in school, Islam was not like a positive or fair depiction compared to other religions. So I would just sit there very quietly, feeling uncomfortable, not knowing what to say. And he's like, yeah. And then there was this time where I'm sitting and, with another group of friends, and he's like, somebody would just say, yeah, blotter, which is like bloody, black-headed, immigrants, kind of referring to immigrants. And he's like, well, I looked at this friend and I said to him, like, and friend, I say, quote unquote, like it was a classmate. And he's like, he's like, I'm sitting, he's like, excuse me. And he says, yeah, he just shrugs and moves away and not caring. So it's kind of like, he's like, and it's also sort of this idea that other people are very blatant about what they think about religion, but then also what religion, the portrayal of religion in both like society, but also in the classroom. And then having, colleagues and friends who he's sitting with, who will say this to other immigrants while he's sitting there. And when he sort of makes an interjection, there's like, yeah, whatever, like, we don't see you like that, but everybody else is kind of like that. But it makes you sort of introspect for a minute, like what's going on. So he said all of these experiences, and then he moved to a university, in Skåne, and he's like, here people actually openly hated religion. And what I really liked about this, he's like, I couldn't really like being a Muslim anymore. And then he had a girlfriend, and he's like, she used to say, she's like, once they got into a fight, and she says, well, I think religion is dumb and stupid, and people who believe in religion are dumb and stupid. And he's like, this is a close romantic relationship. And she's saying this to my face, and I'm like, so what do you think of me? And then she just, looked away. Of course, this relationship didn't really work out, but it's all of these sort of, getting close to Swedes and white Swedes particularly, and then seeing their view about religion in sort of this multi-religious society, which has freedom of religion. But there's these messages that are constantly saying something else. And then he also said something about, like, at the end of my first job interview, they asked me, are you adopted? And I said, how come? And he's like, well, I was really taken aback too. And then he's like, I asked them no. And then they said, well, your Swedish is so good. So he's like, well, I came from an underprivileged, sort of area, and my Swedish was really good. And people had broken Swedish because, of course, people don't really speak good Swedish. And they assumed that I must have adopted parents because if I was born to parents from a foreign country, my Swedish would not be so good. So it's also sort of the idea of achievement that is tied to Swedes, but not to other community or foreign-born individuals or families. So that's the second part. Excuse me, I went on. And then the third part of him crossing this boundary of saying I'm not Muslim, later on he says going through all of these experiences. So I can mention here that eventually he did marry a Swedish woman, and he has a child who he named, who has a very Swedish first and last name, and he also changed his last name to a more Swedish name that he and his partner came up with. So he described all of these experiences and his experience with marriage, and said that and now that he has, like, he's graduated with a technical degree, he has had a job, he's settled, and he's like, well, I feel I'm Swedish now. I feel Swedish, and my friends call me a coconut. And he laughed. He's like, because I'm brown on the outside but white on the inside, but it's sort of like that whiteness is being recognized, or the fact that I've made it in society now makes me feel like I'm more Swedish. And he's like, in the end, I think it's the fact that I'm not invandrare anymore, so I'm not immigrant anymore. And he kept saying this, the word, because he was talking in English. It was an interview in English. He's like, I'm not immigrant anymore. And then, so I just want to stop here and say for 1 minute, like, my own analysis, and this was an analysis because it was a sensitive topic, particularly when someone leaves religion. So I sent this entire analysis back to this person, and I asked him if he would be kind enough to read it and let me know if there was anything that he'd wanted me to change, or an analysis that he did not agree with. And he wrote back saying that, thank you for giving it that kind of spotlight the way that you have. And he said, actually, towards the end, he said, I had tears in my eyes because I thought it was very beautiful. And thank you for not, like, he's like, a lot of times when I give interviews, people sort of focus on just one aspect of, and most of the time they create monsters out of my parents or, my family or even my friends. So he's like, while this was very difficult to read, he's like, it was quite beautiful that you put it together the way that you did. So it was important for me in this project to send back particularly sensitive analyses back to the informed participants and then have them sort of vet it for me. And that was like an iterative process. So I just want to say that there were 3 parts that I did an analysis with crossing boundaries. One was the fact that the parents were very strict and they did not have explanations. And also the fact that, and the second part of how Muslimness, he always associated with sort of this backward working class culture. But then in the end, when he says that he feels Swedish, he's living in a very white neighborhood. He's married a white Swedish woman. His children have sort of names that have nothing to do with Pakistan. He's changed. So he kind of overcame all those identity markers that made him feel that he did not belong. So for me, when I analyzed and I sort of these 3 phases, I kind of say that for him, leaving religion was leaving working class status of his parents. So it was just more than saying that Islam is not for me. It was a culmination of all of these experiences, but also coming to this point and saying that I'm not, from this particular vantage point of being successful. But the last thing I do want to say is that when he ended, he talked about like how he was missing being Pakistani and how he was missing sort of the big Pakistani community. And he's like, yes, it has its downside, but it did have this secure feeling, and I miss the chaos. He's like, everybody brings food, it's very homely, everybody cares for each other's children. But when I'm in my very sort of Swedish side of the family, it just feels very individualistic and divided. And he says that I kind of miss this feeling of Yemenskap. He said like this community feeling, which I feel I don't have here when he's talking about where he's living with his Swedish side of the family. And he's like, but I feel it very much when I'm there, which is, Pakistan. And I did ask him if I could say, like, use these terms. And he said that I have a very Swedish life in Lund and a very Pakistani life in Stockholm. So I thought that was very interesting. So that's the first part of sort of crossing boundaries where people leave religion, but it's not so straightforward as leaving religion for religion's sake or because of family or because of racialization processes. And that's where this intersectionality lens of complex religion really, becomes salient. So in the second one, which is shifting boundaries, where something that was dormant became very salient. And there are several axes of analysis that I did for this one. So in the first one, this person says, well, I have, a Finnish mom and a Pakistani dad. And, religion has always been very fluid. It was not something that we paid attention to. But then I had a cousin that came from Pakistan, and he was like, oh, you don't know how to pray. Let me teach you how to pray. Oh, you don't go to the mosque? He's like, come on, let's go to the mosque. So suddenly this person who came, his cousin from Pakistan, there was this identity that was there. He knew that he was Muslim and he had a Christian background as well. So it was like a mixed sort of identity, but suddenly one became more active than the other. And then there was another story where another one of my participants said that, for me, religion became salient when I moved to London to study. And at that time, in the absence of my parents and my mom particularly, who would say, pray and fast and do this, she's like, when she was not there, I started doing those things on my own because I realized that they have value for me. Like I feel more relaxed, I feel more calm, I feel more like more at home with myself. So the analysis that I did for this one is that, with transnational mobilities, they become sort of catalysts for religious activation. So sometimes these shifts, when you leave home or when someone is coming from Pakistan to, sort of Sweden, there are all these shifts, transnational movements that create this kind of environment for something to become more alive. Or for your attention to become more focused on something in a different way than it was before. The second thing was about like the second analysis that I looked at was there were two, and there were more examples, but these ones that I've highlighted, where when the right-wing populist party sort of came into power or was gaining power, one of my participants who was very active politically said that, when they started sort of, using Muslims and Islamophobia as a part of their political ideology, she's like, she says, thank you, SD, for giving me my religion back. Because then she's like, I realized that I had to, assert my Muslim identity and to show that not all Muslims are the same. So at that time, where being Muslim was something that she really kept under the surface, when this happened, she started to say actively that I am a Muslim and I'm at a concert. I'm a Muslim, but I'm, a woman without a hijab, for example. So things like that. And she sort of started this hashtag also on Twitter, where she asked people in Sweden, particularly like women and men and young people, to sort of talk about hashtag I'm Muslim, but talk about like your everyday life so that people understand there's all kinds of Muslims, not just the ones that they see on media. And then obviously the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I mean, this was like an interesting moment where these global sociopolitical events become catalysts for identity assertion, but also sort of exclusion, because after the terrorist attack, a lot of people used 9/11 as the point after which the bullying in school and sort of, it kind of increased, and discrimination and the way people would talk to you kind of increased in Sweden. So that has a lot to do with global. It's very interesting, like how elsewhere's become, global events become locally embedded, and they change sort of the environment.
Uzma, can I just interrupt?
Yes.
We have now spoken for 40 minutes.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So
okay, I'll quickly
put
just
some time for questions. So
5 more minutes. I'm just
5
gonna
more minutes, and then we'll go to questions.
So without going deeper into the stories, I can just say that the next is sort of this interpersonal relationship dynamics on religious identity, where one partner is more religious than the other. It has an impact, and it brings that identity more salient. multi-religious family practices in such instances where, let's say, one parent is secular and one is more religious. I had a participant who said, oh, now I think it's time for me to explore my mom's side of, rather than, my dad said, I've been secular for a while, now I want to be more religious and see. The mosque also, in terms of shifting boundaries, became this, it's a dual symbol. For some who felt unsafe and who did not have good experiences in the mosque, went away from their identity, whereas some individuals who actually found the mosque to be a very safe place, and they found a role model particularly, it changed their life completely, and they went from sort of being, this individual described as from a bad boy to a completely sort of someone that was a warrior for social justice. So that's like shifting boundaries. With maintaining boundaries, there are different, and I think I'm just going to go through very quickly the way that people sort of negotiate everyday sort of practices that are linked to Muslimness. Was mostly alcohol, negotiating halal, negotiating the hijab. And in my chapter, I actually show that they're not just, again, the kind of interpretations and meanings that are assigned to what could be, for example, alcohol. So for some, they're like, well, I go for my prayer and then I go for a beer. The other one says, well, I think it's a toxin, it harms my body. So and these are all Muslims that have different explanations for why or why not they drink or they don't drink in social situations, but also how other people view them when they don't. And then particularly when Maham says, I'm a Niktaris, she's like, I speak in a language that, because this was a Niktaris was a movement in Sweden against sort of for people who were not like drinking. And so she says, I use the terms that Swedes understand to tell them that, this is a personal decision, not something that is dictated to me by religion, and I'm just doing it and I don't think about it. With halal also, they're like, it has different meanings. They're like, it's important that, the animal has had a good life. So sometimes it's better to be organic, and it's better to sort of become a vegan or a vegetarian, but also that you should have earnings that are halal, which means that you should not be engaging in, making money off of interests, or only sort of investing in things that are good, that have good ecological consequences on the environment as well. And then with the hijab as well, one story that I'll share is that one of my participants says, yeah, I wear a bikini because I believe in the inner hijab. So it's not just my job. My job is to make sure that my eyes are not looking at something, that I'm not like, and I feel like what other people do has nothing to do with me. And then there's all these other reasons. One woman took off the hijab because she couldn't find work. Now, with religiosity, I quickly want to say that there are three things that is happening that explain, all of these practices in Islam. One is that they're using different kinds of interpretations. The other is, what is the utility of that practice in Sweden? Some see it as a great power, spirituality helping them with their psychological well-being. They're able to sort of, the ethics and the morals help them seeing other people's humanity. And then also it becomes very salient to see how parenting the third generation, how from first to second to third, how they're intergenerationally sort of strategizing, making sure that the children integrate into the society, but also that their religion is still salient and important for them. I do have conclusions, but I think we can end here, David. What do you think?
This gives an image of the richness of your thesis. This is just one chapter, and it's so rich on material and interesting stories. So I have a couple of questions, and then we have the questions from the people listening. Okay, so thank you for this. And one first question is this: so you have shown here the sort of complexities, and it's how it's intertwined and how these identities move between different positions. And you have also spoken about maybe you could call it the ethnification of religion, or the religionification of nationality, or something like this. How the Pakistani identity sort of merges with the Muslim identity, and how they are seen as the same. And so one question there is, who is doing this merging of national, ethnic, and religious identity? Is it something that comes from the Swedish sort of majority population, or from the outside, or is it a part of this of the Pakistani heritage, because Pakistan is also a country which is, it's a Muslim country, but it's sort of a secular Muslim country in its origin. So this merging of national and religious identity has been there from the start in Pakistani history. So who is the agent of creating this merging?
I think the participants themselves are agents. And that's exactly, I mean, one of the things where we talked about what you're saying. So the bargaining strategies that I have sort of highlighted in the conclusion, and I also say that, of course, if I was to do this study maybe a year from today, or if I was to go back and interview the same participants, because, maybe they've had children now, half of them were not married at the time, maybe now they're married. A lot of them were thinking of moving abroad and then coming back, So I think the stories now would be different from the stories that I had. So I say that with a caveat when I wrote this chapter on these 4 bargaining strategies, where within these 42 people, I found that these participants themselves were sort of classifying themselves and saying, well, I mean, and of course, these are names that I have given, but for the kind of belonging that they felt that they needed in order to feel a part of society, that's their own interpretation. Again, that whole idea of interpretation, utility of practice, and how they see what they're able to transfer to the 3rd generation also as a resource. Because given that, Pakistan is a very rich country in terms of, practices and just in terms of people. And like you said, I mean, it has secular beginnings, and it has many different languages, many different sects. So I think there are multiple things that are acting on this agent, and they're both macro level, like global events, they have an impact. And I think that's what I tried to show, that things are not, it's like a top down and bottom up. So the responses are usually bottom up, but we're acted on by sort of, global events, then local entanglements, and then political changes, the way that certain minorities are being viewed. And then you come down to the agent, and this agent is like a part of both this religious landscape, the societal landscape. It has this ethnic, sort of rich ethnic background, and it can go, and these individuals go back and forth visiting their relatives to different countries in Europe, in United States, in Australia. Even their relatives are scattered, so they don't only go to Pakistan. So it's become, I think, highly individualized, and they're both acting and they're acted upon. And I think that is the part which, I mean, the last thing that I wanted to say is that you have to understand this agency, and it's the capacity to assert one's own vision and hopes. And it depends on the malleability and openness of persons to time, leaving those who desire change in others equally exposed to transformation. So when we want change in other people, or whatever it is that we want to change, it impinges not only on us, but also it exposes us to that to others and to ourselves, that what does that transformation really mean. So when people are asking, let's say, saying that, Muslims are, for example, suspicious or problematic or terrorists, or, immigrants are being racialized, and a lot of times immigrants in Sweden are being racialized as Muslims, and then it becomes a double bind, that not only are you an immigrant, you're also Muslim, so it's double. But then what is the change that is expected? So a lot of times I feel like we have to understand as human beings where we are headed, and perhaps whatever is acting upon us also needs to be exposed. So most of the time we have to name the kind of problems that people on ground are facing in order to actually bring a very wholesome and holistic sort of change that benefits everyone.
Yeah. Concerning this, the last slide was on the 4 bargains that you had found in your conclusions. And one question is, did you find anyone who would say like this, that is sort of a Swedish Muslim bargain that is not, that see no contradiction in this, like saying, for instance, I'm 100% Swede, I'm Swedish, this is my language, this is my country, I'm also 100% Muslim. Did you find that?
Yes, and I call that the hybrid bargain. And then interestingly, so it's the Swedish Muslim belonging, but this person who says that I'm very, so in this particular bargain, they leave out Pakistaniness because they think being Pakistani is the problem, because a lot of their parents' ideas of Islam come from their culture. And in order for them to try to understand the basic principles that are mentioned in the Quran, or that are considered, salient to Islam, they match exactly with, Swedish ideals and the way the Swedish society runs. But then this person says to me, but I'm like, so are you a Muslim Swede or a Swedish Muslim? And he said, hold on. He said, given that the times now that we're living in are extremely problematic and citizenship is really under scrutiny, he's like, let's say tomorrow, all the immigrants or brown people like me are like thrown out. He's like, then I have to say that I'm a Muslim Swede because I'm Muslim first. Nobody can take that away from me. You can take away my Swedish passport and you can say you're not a Swedish national anymore because I can't prove, but you can't take away my Muslimness. So that was interesting how he said that I find that there's a lot of compatibility between Islam and Sweden, but not so much Pakistan. But that said, if it comes to that, I'm Muslim first and Swedish next.
I met this Pakistani guy in Liverpool. I was in Liverpool a month ago, and I met this Pakistani guy. They have a big Pakistani South Asian Desi community there in Liverpool. And they have been there for generations. And I met this guy, and he was we had a conversation. And then I asked him, which politics is more interesting for you? Which do you follow the most? Pakistani politics, because we spoke about Imran Khan, and or UK politics. And he said it was Pakistani politics. This was much more interesting for him than UK politics. Although he was UK born he was second or perhaps third generation Pakistani. What would your interlocutors say to questions like this?
I'm very glad that you said that, because one of the things that they said to me, particularly the second generation in Sweden, they said that the thing that defines us and our parents is that we follow Swedish politics and they follow Pakistani politics. So, but the second generation Pakistanis in Sweden definitely have much more of this kind of embeddedness into the Swedish society and following the Swedish local sort of, news and transformations. Whereas their parents, and by association, again, there's a lot of change in that too, which I describe in the chapter on marriage, because in the second generation, arranged marriage is definitely the mode of finding appropriate partners for second generation children. And because partners are coming from Pakistan and most of these partners are men, so in the second generation, it's not women that are coming in arranged marriages, it's the men that are coming in arranged marriages. So then the family here also now has new connections with another family in Pakistan. That husband or that partner is now first generation. So now the third generation has a first generation dad and a second generation mom. And then the third generation kid has connections to Pakistan in a completely different way. So you may have that the second generation woman is watching Swedish politics, but her husband is watching Pakistani news. And by virtue of that, she's kind of up to date with both.
Okay. So now there are many questions, so please answer briefly. Yes. First question, and this is for me, and then I will let in from the Q&A. Yes. In this, you have pointed to one pull factor. There are push and pull factors pushing people into this different bargains then, I suppose. And you have mentioned that the Sweden Democrat politics and Islamophobia and polarization against Islam and conflict globally pushes people towards a stronger Muslim identity. Your material. Have you found any other sort of push or pull factors that push or pull your interlocutors into either of these bargains?
I think one of the things would definitely be that their own perception about the sense of safety. So I was actually visiting Pakistan in December, and I met a Norwegian family, a Pakistani Norwegian family, on a bus tour of inner city of Karachi. And they were having an argument because they had a woman had just come from Pakistan in arranged marriage to a third generation Pakistani. And she was arguing about the merits of living in Pakistan, and he was arguing against the merits of Pakistan. So I think if we talk about, I don't like to use push and pull because it becomes kind of causal relation, which is not what I'm doing at all, because it's more it's a process and it's very much layered. But I do think the fact that the ability to sort of, the economic ability for someone to be realized in Pakistan, the ability to feel safe in Pakistan. The kind of politics in Pakistan at the moment is extremely, dicey, with a lot of sort of censorship and military control. So that becomes one of those factors where you want to, again, be more Muslim and be more Swedish than Pakistani. So I do think that one of the things that a lot of times the second generation hold on to be able to live, even Gen Z kind of, they can live with the ethical principles Islam offers, but the cultural practices from their parents country that they unquestioningly sort of were a part of, that's just open for debate now. I think even in Pakistan, to be honest, not just here.
Okay. So now a question from the Q&A.
Yeah.
You mentioned one of your interlocutors who had left Islam. And the question is, how has this been received by the community? There's a notion called closeted apostates. So people leave Islam and then they are sort of hiding away or being hidden away. How has people leaving Islam or being atheist or secular, how has that been received by the greater?
I mean, first of all, I can say that this was a male interlocutor, and most of the time, men, there's sort of gender differences in the Pakistani community also of how this news is received. So he did face a lot of, there's problems from his own parents who were sort of first saying that, he's like, when you go down the line, it's kind of like arranged marriage. Okay, then not arranged, but love marriage with another person from the, same community and the same sort of religion. But then it's like, okay, how about love marriage just with a Muslim? Okay, then how about like, and then in the end, you don't really have much of a choice. So he said that for him, his parents did have issues, but at the end, they agreed as long as he would do sort of a Muslim wedding. Like, so they did not ask for the spouse to convert, but it was important for the parents to have a Muslim marriage in front of the community. So now this person is not closeted, but because he's living like a very Swedish life, he's not very much, because in all the events that I've gone to, I've met the sibling, but I've not really met him because he lives a very different life altogether. So I think he made a choice in the very beginning to leave the community and to not abide by its rules. And therefore, he has no issues in terms of, openly saying that, okay, I'm not religious and I'm married to a Swedish woman and this is just where I'm at. But also it would, for most women in my sample who have married Swedish men, they've done so when their partners have converted. So I do think that, it's absolutely true with closeted apostates, but also, I mean, religiosity, even in Pakistan and within Pakistani communities, it can be quite performative, where you don't really deep down know how each individual, unless you really talk to them about this. And religion seems to be a topic that a lot of people don't talk about. And I have a very good example in a long story that I don't want to go into about the kind of negotiations this one person makes by, he's like, when I'm with my dad's community, I use my Swedish name. When I'm with my Swedish friends, I use my Swedish name, and I'm like, so what happens when your dad's friend sees you sitting with your Swedish friends? He's like, then I'll use the name that I have with the Swedish friends. So people, and he's like, and I was just laughing and he's like, yeah. And he was just shrugging his shoulders. He's like, yeah, it's just what you do. So this is not to say that I do not problematize that. But in the sense that the participants do problematize this, and then they also find spaces for resolution, because there's a part of a conversation in this that I've used in the chapter where he talks to his mother by saying, what's the problem if I don't have Islam in my home? What's the issue? So these conversations are now happening, and this is a slow transformation. And also I feel like it's very important to understand that the parents, most of these parents have come from really small towns and rural villages in Pakistan, and they came to Sweden and they're suddenly exposed to a new environment. And a lot of this is, psychological, where you try to sort of, you can't fit in because you look too different. You also can, be partially assimilated into the society when you don't have access. And then that it's a fear-based parenting also, where you don't want them to leave Islam, but you also don't them how to you also don't have the language to explain what it offers them. And I think that was what drew me to this concept, like this thesis in the first place, that in Sweden, in such a secular, landscape, this is like, it's not a windfall gain to be born into a Muslim family, you know. So I don't know if that answers the question, but because I was seeking self-identified Muslims, I found only a few. But it would be very interesting study to actually also look at those people that, remain Muslim, but only for the sake of the community. They don't speak out much.
Okay, there are so many questions, but our time is up. So just one very brief
Oh
final.
no.
If you want to read, if I want to read, or someone wants to read your thesis, can you find it at the web page of Lund University?
Yes, you actually can. If you just search Swedish Pardesi belonging narratives of second generation Pakistani Muslims, you will be able very easily to find. And I'm so sorry about the time. If somebody has questions, they can write to me. I don't know if you can share my email address with the people that joined in. Maybe we could put that in the chat.
Yes, I have already done so, actually.
Perfect. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I can definitely answer these questions via email.
Yes. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Uzma Kazi, for this
Thank you,
presentation,
David.
for your good work and bringing new knowledge into this interesting and fascinating field.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Bye, and thanks.
Bye. Bye-bye.